The slow cataloguing of a provincial button museum. The town was the kind of town that did not so much announce itself as settle quietly into the bend of a slow river, the way a cat settles into the warm dent of a cushion, and at the heart of it, on a street that no one had ever had reason to hurry down, there stood a small museum with a green door and a brass knocker that had not been knocked in living memory. It was a building of modest brick, 2 windows above and 2 windows below, with a roof of gray slate that had softened over the years to the color of a winter sky, and inside it kept, among other gentle things, the largest collection of buttons in the entire province, though the province had never quite found the occasion to be proud of this, and the buttons had never asked it to be. On this particular morning, which was a Tuesday, or perhaps a Wednesday, for the days of such a week tended to lean against one another and lose their edges, the museum opened its doors to no one in particular. The opening of the doors was itself a slow and considered ceremony. There was the turning of the key, which was an old key, large and a little blunt, and which required a small persuasion in the lock, a gentle backward pressure and then a forward one, until the mechanism gave way with a soft and satisfied sound, like a sigh that had been held for a very long time and was glad at last to be let out. Then there was the pulling back of the door, which moved on hinges that had been oiled at some unremembered point in the past and now made only the faintest whisper, a sound so quiet that it seemed almost to be the sound of the morning itself leaning into the room. The air inside was cool and still and smelled of old paper, of wood polish gone faint with age, and of that particular dust which is not dirty at all but rather the slow and patient settling of years, the kind of dust that drifts rather than falls, and that gathers in the corners of quiet rooms the way thoughts gather at the edge of sleep. The light came in through the 2 front windows in 2 broad and slanting columns, and within those columns the dust turned and drifted and floated, going nowhere in no particular hurry, so that the whole room seemed to be very gently breathing. The volunteer who had come to tend the buttons that day was a woman named Edith, though the buttons did not know her name and would not have minded it if they had. She had been coming to the museum on quiet weekdays for some years now, ever since she had retired from a life of careful work that had involved a great deal of counting and a great deal of patience, and she had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she rather missed the counting and the patience, and that the buttons were happy to provide both. She was a woman of unhurried movements and comfortable shoes, and she wore a cardigan the color of oatmeal that had pockets deep enough for a handkerchief, a spare pencil, and a small tin of peppermints that she liked but rarely remembered to open. She came in through the green door and she let it close behind her with that same soft whisper, and she stood for a moment in the entrance hall and let the quiet of the place settle over her like a shawl. There was nothing that needed doing urgently. There was, in fact, nothing that needed doing urgently anywhere in the whole of the town, and certainly nothing in the museum, where the most pressing matter was the slow and pleasant cataloguing of the button collection, a task that had no deadline, no audience, and no end that anyone could foresee, which was, to Edith's mind, very nearly the ideal arrangement for any task at all. She made her way past the front room, where the larger objects were kept under their glass, the spinning wheel and the milk churn and the framed map of the parish drawn in faded brown ink, and she went through to the back room, which was her favorite, and which was where the buttons lived. It was a long, narrow room with a single tall window at the far end, and along one wall stood a great wooden cabinet of many drawers, each drawer shallow and wide and fitted with a small brass handle that had been polished by years of gentle pulling to a soft and buttery shine. The cabinet had once belonged to a draper, or so the story went, though there was no one left who could say for certain, and now it held the buttons of 100 years and more, arranged with the kind of patience that only the truly unhurried can manage. Before she could begin, however, there was the small and pleasant business of arranging her things, And Edith was a great believer in the arranging of things. She sat down upon the wide wooden table that stood beneath the window her ledger, which was a thick book bound in dark green cloth with corners worn pale by handling, and she opened it to the page where she had left off the week before, smoothing the paper flat with the side of her hand so that it lay obediently open. The paper was the soft, slightly furred paper of a ledger that has been written in for many years, and it took the pencil well, and Edith liked the feeling of the pencil moving across it, the gentle drag and give of it, more than she would have liked the cold glide of a pen. Then she set down her pencil, which she had sharpened that morning at home with a small knife while she drank her first cup of tea, and which had a good long point on it that would last, she judged, through the brass buttons at least, and possibly into the bone. And then she set down beside the ledger her second cup of tea, which she had carried through from the little kitchen at the back where there was a kettle and a single chipped pot and a tin of biscuits that she sometimes shared with no one. The tea was already beginning to cool, for she had made it some minutes before and had let it sit while she opened the doors and breathed the quiet air, and she knew that it would go on cooling through the morning until at some point she would lift it and find it gone quite cold and drink it anyway, because that was the way of tea in a museum, and there was no sense in fighting it. She drew out the wooden chair, which scraped only a very little against the floorboards, and she sat down upon it, and she settled herself, which is to say she shifted her weight a small amount this way and then a small amount that way until the chair and her bones and the worn cushion all agreed with one another, and then she was still. She looked for a moment at the column of dust turning in the light from the tall window, the way it rose and fell and drifted sideways for no reason she could name, each speck of it going about its slow and private business, and she thought, not for the first time, that there were worse ways to spend a life than watching dust settle in a quiet room, and that she could not for the moment think of a single one of them. When she was ready, and being ready took as long as it took and was not to be rushed, she leaned forward and took hold of the brass handle of the topmost drawer on the left, the drawer where the brass buttons were kept, and she drew it open. It came out smoothly, the wood sliding against wood with that soft and rolling sound that old drawers make, a sound like a held breath let slowly out, and there before her lay the brass buttons in their shallow wooden trays, lined up in their little compartments, each one resting in its place as it had rested for years. The brass buttons were the color of old honey, of late afternoon, of the inside of a church bell, and they had been dimmed by time to a soft and even glow, so that they did not flash or glint but rather seemed to hold a small amount of warmth within themselves, as if they had each kept a little of the light of all the days they had passed through. Edith picked up the first of them between her finger and her thumb, and she turned it over in the light, and she felt the small cool weight of it, the way it sat in the cup of her fingers as if it belonged there. It was a military button, she could see, of the kind that had once held shut the coat of some soldier or postman or station master, and upon its face there was an engraving, very faint now, worn nearly smooth by the rubbing of 100 years of fingers and cloth, the ghost of a crown above the ghost of a wreath, and around the edge a thin raised rim that her thumbnail found before her eye did. She held it close and she tilted it this way and that until the light caught the engraving and brought it up out of the brass like a thing rising slowly from the bottom of a pond, and she made out, or thought she made out, the suggestion of letters that might once have been a regiment or a county or a coaching company, though the letters had long since worn down to mere hints of themselves, soft hollows in the metal that the eye filled in more than the metal offered. She set it down again in its compartment, gently, so that it made the smallest click against the wood, and she took up her pencil and she wrote in the ledger, in her small and even hand, the number of the button, which was the next number after the one she had written the week before, and then its material, which was brass, and then its shape, which was round and slightly domed, and then its size, which she measured with a little brass ruler kept for the purpose, and which came to rather less. then an inch, and then its condition, which was worn but sound, and then, in the wider column she kept for such things, a few words about the engraving, the crown and the wreath and the worn-away letters, written carefully so that anyone coming after her, should anyone ever come, would know what she had seen. And then she took up the next button, and she did the same again, and so the morning began to settle into its rhythm, which was the rhythm of a thing done slowly and well, with no thought of finishing. Pick up the button, turn it in the light, feel its weight, read its face. Set it down with a small click. Write the number, the material, the shape, the size, the condition, the few quiet words. Pick up the next. The brass buttons were many, for brass had been the metal of working coats and uniforms and the everyday business of being dressed, and the draper had collected them as a draper might, by the handful and the card and the spilled jarful, and they filled their drawer to its corners. There were buttons stamped with anchors, for the men who had worked the river barges, and buttons stamped with the wheel and wing of the railway, and buttons stamped with nothing at all, plain and domed and modest, that had done their quiet work on the fronts of 1,000 ordinary mornings and asked for no remembering. There were buttons with the small raised heads of foxes, for some hunt long since disbanded, and buttons with the curling initials of a tailor whose shop had stood 3 streets over and whose sign had come down before Edith was born. Each one Edith took up in its turn and turned in the light, and the light came in through the tall window and lay across the table in a long warm band, and the dust turned within it, and the morning moved so slowly that it scarcely seemed to move at all. Now and then she paused. She did not pause because she was tired, for the work was not tiring, but rather because a particular button asked to be paused over, and Edith had learned long ago that a button that asks to be paused over should be paused over. There was one, near the middle of the drawer, that was larger than the rest and heavier, a great domed thing of brass gone nearly brown, and upon its face was the engraving of a ship under full sail, every line of the rigging still faintly there, the small swell of the sea beneath it suggested by a few worn curves, and Edith held this one for a long time and thought of the coat it had come from, and the man who had worn the coat, and the cold mornings the coat had been buttoned against, and the warm rooms it had been unbuttoned in, and she found that she could not think of these things sadly, for they were all so long ago and so gently gone that they had passed beyond sadness into something quieter, the way an old grief becomes in time merely a soft and weathered fact, like a stone in a wall. She drank a little of her tea, which had cooled by now to that temperature at which tea is neither hot nor cold but only mildly and pleasantly present, and she looked again at the column of light from the tall window, which had shifted a little as the morning advanced, sliding slowly across the floorboards the way the shadow of a sundial slides, so slowly that you cannot see it move, and yet there it is, moved. And then she set down her cup and took up the next brass button, and the next, until at last she had reached the end of the drawer, and she sat back, and she counted the entries she had made in the ledger, and she found that she had recorded 143 brass buttons, which seemed to her a fine and round and satisfying number, even though it was not round at all, and she said it softly to herself, 143, just to hear the shape of it in the quiet room. She closed the brass drawer, sliding it home with that same soft rolling sound, until it met its frame with a gentle thud and a final small click, and she sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap and felt the pleasant emptiness of a thing completed that leads directly and without fuss into a thing about to begin. For below the brass drawer there was another drawer, and this was the drawer that Edith loved best of all, the drawer of the mother of pearl, and she always saved it for the part of the day when the light was good, because the mother of pearl needed the light in a way that the modest brass did not. She took hold of the brass handle of the second drawer, and she drew it open slowly, more slowly than she had drawn the first, the way you might draw back a curtain on a view you already know is beautiful, in order to make the pleasure last, and as the drawer came out the light from the tall window fell upon the buttons within it and they woke. That was the only word Edith had ever found for it. They woke. For the mother-of-pearl buttons did not simply have a color, the way the brass had its honey color and the wood would have its brown. The mother-of-pearl had instead a kind of inner weather, a shifting and shimmering and sliding of colors that lived just beneath the surface and came up to meet the light and changed as you moved them, so that a button that was milky white when it lay still became, when you tilted it, a soft wash of pink, and then, tilted further, a breath of green like the underside of a leaf, and then a pale and watery blue like the sky reflected in the river on a still day, all of these colors sliding one into another with no edge between them, the way the colors slide in oil upon water, or in the sky after the sun has gone down. She lifted the first of them, a flat round button with 2 holes in the center and a faint ring scored around its rim, and she held it in the band of light from the window and turned it slowly, and she watched the colors move across its face, the milk and the pink and the green and the blue, surfacing and sinking, and she thought, as she always thought, of the place these buttons had come from, which was not a draper's shop or a soldier's coat but the inside of a shell. The patient inner lining of some creature that had lived its whole slow life at the bottom of a warm sea, laying down layer upon layer of this shimmering stuff one thin sheet at a time, over years, over a lifetime, building this quiet beauty in the dark without ever once seeing the light that it was made to catch. And here it was, that beauty, cut into a small round button with 2 holes in it, lying in a wooden tray in a quiet museum in a quiet town, catching the light at last on a Tuesday, or perhaps a Wednesday, while a woman in an oatmeal cardigan turned it in her fingers and admired it, and no one else in the whole world knew or needed to know that it was there. She did not hurry over the mother-of-pearl. There would have been no point in hurrying over the mother-of-pearl, for the whole virtue of it lay in the slow turning, the watching of the colors come and go. She took up each button in its turn and held it in the light and turned it this way and that, and she watched the weather move beneath its surface, and only then did she set it down and take up her pencil and write its number and its material and its shape and its size and, in the wider column, a few words about its color, though she always felt that her words fell short of the buttons, for there was no word for the way the pink became the green became the blue, no word that held all of that sliding light, and so she wrote simply iridescent, and let the word stand for more than it could carry, the way a single small word so often must. The mother-of-pearl buttons were of many kinds. There were the plain flat ones with their 2 holes or their 4, the workaday pearl of everyday blouses and Sunday shirts. There were carved ones, where some patient hand had cut a flower or a star or a small radiating pattern into the surface so that the carving caught the light differently from the smooth, and these Edith turned for a long time, watching the cut lines flare and dim. There were greatcoat buttons of pearl, broad as a coin, that must have fastened some grand and forgotten garment, and tiny glove buttons of pearl no bigger than a lentil, that had done up the wrists of hands long since folded away. There were buttons of the gray pearl, smoky and dark, that held their colors close and showed them only grudgingly, a flash of bronze, a hint of plum, before sinking back into their soft gray reserve. And there were buttons of the white pearl, the bright clear pearl, that gave up their colors freely and gladly, flooding pink and green and blue at the smallest tilt, generous as a child showing you everything it has. The light from the tall window lay across the open drawer and the open ledger and Edith's slow hands, and the dust turned in the light, and outside the window, very far away and very faint, a wood pigeon made its soft and rolling call, 3 notes and then 2, 3 notes and then 2, over and over, with long quiet pauses between, and the sound of it came through the glass softened and rounded so that it seemed less a sound than the memory of a sound, and it folded into the quiet of the room, rather than breaking it. Edith heard it without quite hearing it, the way you hear your own breathing, and she went on turning the buttons in the light, and the colors went on sliding beneath their surfaces, milk and pink and green and blue, and the morning eased without any haste at all toward noon. She paused at one point to eat the small sandwich she had brought wrapped in greaseproof paper, and she ate it slowly at the table beside the open drawer, looking at the buttons while she chewed, and she drank the last of her tea, which had by now gone entirely cold but which she drank anyway, as she had known she would, and which tasted of nothing very much but was companionable all the same. And then she folded the greaseproof paper into a small neat square and put it in her cardigan pocket beside the unopened tin of peppermints, and she wiped her fingers carefully on her handkerchief, for one does not handle mother-of-pearl with crumbs upon one's fingers, and she went back to her turning and her writing, and the afternoon began. It was somewhere in the early part of the afternoon, when the light had swung round a little and lay now at a different angle across the table, that Edith made her mistake. It was a small mistake, the kind of mistake that only a person doing careful work could make, and she made it gently and without alarm. She had taken up a button of pale pearl, carved with a small flower at its center, and she had written down its number and its material and its shape, and then, her mind perhaps having drifted for a moment to the wood pigeon or to the slant of the light, she had written in the size column the size of the button before it, which had been a larger button, so that the number she set down was bigger than the button in her hand. She noticed it almost at once, in the way one notices a single wrong note in a familiar tune, a small snag in the smoothness of things. And she stopped and looked at what she had written and looked at the button in her hand and saw that they did not agree. And she did not sigh, and she did not frown, and she certainly did not scold herself, for she had long ago given up the habit of scolding herself over small things, having found it to be a poor use of a quiet afternoon. Instead she took the soft gray eraser that she kept beside the ledger, and she rubbed out the wrong number, gently, with small careful strokes, brushing the little crumbs of rubber away with the side of her hand so that they fell to the floor to join the patient dust, and then she measured the button again with her little brass ruler, properly this time, and she wrote down the right number in its place, and the ledger was whole again. And she sat for a moment with the corrected ledger before her and thought about the smallness of the error, and about how pleasant a thing it was that the error had been so small, and that there had been no one to see it, and nothing to come of it, and all the time in the world to put it right. She thought that in a great many places in the world, in offices, and on ledgers and in the racing minds of busy people, a wrong number was a thing of consequence, a thing to be feared, a small disaster that led to other disasters in a long unhappy chain. But here, in this quiet room, a wrong number was only a wrong number, a thing the size of a button, easily rubbed away and written again, and the buttons did not mind, and the dust did not mind, and the wood pigeon went on calling its 3 notes and its 2 notes with no idea that anything had happened at all, because nothing very much had. And she thought that this was perhaps the deepest comfort of the whole quiet business, deeper even than the colors of the pearl, that here, at least, a mistake was allowed to be small, and to be mended, and then to be forgotten. She finished the mother-of-pearl drawer in this gentle frame of mind, turning the last few buttons in the lowered light and watching their colors come and go, and then she closed the drawer slowly, easing it home until it met its frame with the soft final click that she had come to think of as the punctuation of her afternoons, and she opened the drawer below it, which was the drawer of the wooden buttons. The wooden buttons were quieter than all that had come before, and Edith felt herself grow quieter to match them. They had none of the warm glow of the brass and none of the shifting weather of the pearl, they were simply, modestly brown, the brown of old furniture and of fallen leaves and of strong tea, each one carved or turned from some honest wood and worn smooth by use, and they sat in their compartments without catching the light at all, content to be exactly what they were. She took them up one by one, and they were warm to the touch in a way the brass had not been and the pearl had not been, warm the way wood is always somehow warm, as if it remembered being a tree, and she turned them in her fingers and felt the close fine grain of them, the tiny ridges and whorls that the carver had left and the years had smoothed, and she wrote down their numbers and their sizes and, in the wider column, a few words about the grain, the way it swirled here in a knot or ran there in a straight clean line. There were wooden buttons of every plainness. There were toggle buttons, long and rounded, that had fastened duffel coats against the river fog. There were flat round wooden buttons, with their holes worn slightly oval by the thread that had passed through them for years. There were buttons of dark wood and buttons of pale wood and buttons of a wood gone almost black with age and oil, and Edith took them all up in their turn, and the room grew quieter around her, or perhaps it was only that she grew quieter within it, settling further and further into the soft slow rhythm of the work the way a stone settles into the bed of a stream. And below the wooden buttons there was one drawer more, and this was the last, and this was the drawer of the bone. The bone buttons were the quietest of all, quieter even than the wood, pale and smooth and cool, the color of old ivory and old piano keys and the moon when it is low and faint behind a thin cloud. They had been made long ago, most of them, cut from bone by patient hands in the days before the cheaper buttons came, and they had the slightly uneven, hand-finished look of things made one at a time, no two of them exactly alike, each with its own small character of shape and shade. Edith took them up gently, for they were the most fragile of all her buttons, and she turned them in the lowering light, and she found that she handled them almost tenderly, the way you might handle something very old and very tired that has earned its rest. The bone was cool against her fingers, cool and smooth and faintly waxy, and the buttons made the smallest sound when she set them down, a tiny dry click, smaller than the brass and smaller than the pearl, the sound a moth might make if a moth made sounds. She wrote their numbers and their sizes in her ledger, and the words she wrote in the wider column grew shorter now, for the bone buttons did not ask for many words, they were plain and pale and quiet and old, and there was little to say of them beyond that they were plain and pale and quiet and old, which was, when you came to think of it, a great deal to say of anything, and quite enough. The afternoon light had grown long now, and golden, and it came in through the tall window low and level, lying across the room in a deep amber band that touched the edge of the cabinet and the corner of the table and turned the pale bone buttons in Edith's hand to the color of warm cream. The dust still turned within the light, but more slowly now, or so it seemed, settling at last as the air of the room grew still and the day let go of its small momentum. The wood pigeon had stopped its calling some time ago, and had gone wherever wood pigeons go in the evening, and now there was no sound at all in the room but the soft drag of Edith's pencil and the tiny dry click of the bone buttons going back into their trays, and even these sounds grew rarer and softer as she came toward the end. She took up the last of the bone buttons, which lay alone in the last compartment of the last drawer, a small round button worn very smooth, with 4 holes set in a square at its center and the faintest ghost of a ring scored around its edge, and she held it for a long moment in the last of the golden light. She turned it slowly, and it gave back no color, only a soft pale gleam, the gleam of something that has been held by many hands and warmed by many hands and asked for nothing in return. And she thought, as she so often thought at the end of a drawer, of all the coats and dresses and shirts and gloves that all these buttons had once fastened, all the mornings of dressing and all the evenings of undressing, all the cold and the warmth and the rain and the sun that these small quiet things had passed through on their way to this drawer, and how they had outlived every garment they had ever fastened, and every hand that had ever done them up, and how they rested here now, all of them, in their orderly trays, with nothing left to fasten and nowhere left to be, and how that was not sad at all, but only peaceful, the way the end of a long day is peaceful, the way the bottom of a deep and dreamless sleep is peaceful. She set the last button down in its place, and it made its small dry click, and she wrote its number and its size and a very few words, and then she laid down her pencil, which had worn down through the long afternoon nearly to a stub, and she closed the ledger, smoothing her hand once across its dark green cloth, and she pushed the last drawer slowly home. It slid against its frame with the soft rolling sound of wood on wood, and it met its place, and it closed, with the gentle final click that she had been listening for all day, the click that meant that the drawer was shut and the buttons were counted and the work, for today, was done. She sat for a while in the deepening quiet, with the closed ledger before her and the closed cabinet beside her and the last of the golden light fading slowly from the floor, and she did not move, and she did not think of anything very much, but only sat, and breathed, and let the stillness of the room come into her and settle there. The dust had stopped turning now, or had drifted down at last to rest upon the sills and the floor and the tops of the drawers, settling so softly that it made no sound at all, building its patient quiet layer upon the patient quiet of the museum, the way the creature in the warm sea had once built its shimmering pearl, one thin sheet at a time, over years, asking nothing. And then, slowly, for there was no reason ever to do anything quickly here, Edith rose from her chair and gathered her things, her ledger and her stub of pencil and her empty cold cup, and she carried the cup through to the little kitchen and rinsed it and set it upside down on the draining board to dry, and she put the ledger away in its drawer in the table where it lived, and she stood for a last moment in the doorway of the long narrow room and looked at the great cabinet of many drawers. All of them closed now, all of them holding their buttons in the dark, the brass and the pearl and the wood and the bone, counted and noted and resting in their orderly compartments, each one in its place. Then she turned, and she walked back through the front room past the spinning wheel and the milk churn and the faded brown map, and she went out through the green door into the soft evening, and she drew the door closed behind her with its faint and final whisper, and she turned the large blunt key in the old lock, the forward pressure and then the backward one, until the mechanism gave its soft and satisfied sound and the door was locked. And she put the key in her deep cardigan pocket beside the unopened tin of peppermints and the small folded square of greaseproof paper, and she walked away down the quiet street in the last of the light, in no hurry at all, leaving the buttons behind her in the dark and the stillness, in their drawers, in their trays, in their places, all of them counted, all of them quiet, all of them resting now in their long and orderly and undisturbed sleep,